IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi, and I have with me Pranav Gupta. He is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, and his research interests include party systems, voting behavior, and the politics of public service delivery. So, first of all, a very warm welcome, Pranav.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Today we thought we'll discuss this very kind of interesting phenomenon which has been happening actually for last many years, is the rise of women in the Indian bureaucracy, which also includes judiciary. So we'll discuss what is this phenomenon, why is it happening, what are the implications of this, and does this kind of a signal shift of, let's say, priorities of the government given the higher representation, or is it that even this representation is kind of constrained by the stereotypes that there is about females, like what kind of works uh, can they do. So Pranav, do you have can you give us a brief background of women representation in bureaucracy, and how has it changed over the years?
So, Saurabh, I think the one big thing that me and my co-author Anustub Agnihotri talk about, and this is a trend that even others have kind of noted over the past few years, is that what we are finding in India is that there's been a substantial rise in the proportion of women in the bureaucracy. If we look at, and this is happening across levels. So if you look at UPSC or the top services such as joinees to the Indian Administrative Service, or at the state level, at the provincial civil services, or in various other sort of avenue bureaucratic offices such as lower level judiciary, etc., we find there's been a consistent rise in the proportion of women. Now, of course, this rise is something that should be appreciated, that should be celebrated. But I think at the same time, what we must be cognizant about is that it still kind of remains far from the actual proportion of women in the society. It still remains far from mirroring that. So, for instance, if we think of a proportion of candidates kind of selected in the civil service exam conducted by the UPSC at the national level. So in 1990, the proportion of women was about 14%, which rose to something like 20% around 2015. And in the last 7-8 years, it's again jumped substantially. In 2022, it reached about 34%. Now that's 34% of all candidates that were selected for appointment in the UPSC exam. 34% of them were women. Of course, it's still far away from the 50%, from the approximately 50% ratio that it should reach for it to mirror the society. But this is a significant change that's happening, because if you just think, and it could have various impacts.
It is quite substantial, right? From 13 to kind of 34 in about 3 decades. But I am kind of wondering, we talk about this representation in IAS and bureaucracy. Is this, how significant is this shift even at state levels? So in your paper, you talk about Odisha. Can you elaborate on that?
So yes, so we tried to. So one kind of question that comes up is that, of course, this rise is happening, and maybe this rise is this phenomena is kind of limited to a few states, or limited to states which have done well in terms of economic development or various indicators of gender equality. So maybe this change is it could be argued that this change is kind of concentrated in these specific states. But what we find in general is that that this seems to be a pan-India phenomena. For instance, a similar trend is visible in Uttar Pradesh when it comes to recruitment to the provincial civil service. So, for instance, in UP in 2030, only about 1/5 of candidates selected in the PCS. 1/5 of PCS recruits were women. Now, 2020, that rises to 26%, and and it's a consistent rise that's happening every year. Similarly, Odisha, we find a substantial rise in the last decade or two. So in terms of what we are finding, this seems to be a pan-India phenomena. This is not just limited to kind of see the PCS, IAS, UPSC exam. These are kind of premier services, right? These are services. These are kind of elite services. But this is a phenomenon that is also happening at various levels of the bureaucracies. For example, if we just look at recruitment through the staff selection commission, so even there, which is recruitment for the lower levels of bureaucracy, even there we find that there's been an increase in the proportion of women recruits.
Yeah. So, but I'm curious. I mean, in your research, what are some reasons that can be attributed to this jump? So it is happening across the country, across states, across all the levels, and it is pretty significant. So, like, is there a kind of a social change? Is it more in terms of are is it in terms of their better access to education by women? So what are the different reasons one can attribute to this rise?
So I think when you're thinking about the reasons behind this, I think it's very important to think about the underlying. We also think about the underlying process. Okay, so it's totally possible. It's a possibility that there's no rise in terms of women participation or kind of becoming more willing to enter to apply for these exams or to get to join these services. What maybe could be happening, possible that's one possibility, right? That essentially the number of women who are appearing for these exams is still the same. It's just that for some reason a higher proportion of women are getting selected, because the numbers that I shared with you earlier are essentially about proportion of women who eventually join these services. So it would have been totally possible that the number of women appearing for these exams would have been pretty much the same, but it's just that it's just that the proportion of women getting selected could have increased. But what we find, and that's a good finding in terms of what were the changes that is happening in the Indian society. What we find is there's also a substantial increase in the number of women appearing in these exams. So, for instance, if you just think about the UPSC prelims, so the proportion of women appearing in UPSC prelims nearly kind of tripled from about the number tripled from about 24% or 64,000 women to about 1.8 lakh women in just a matter of 9 years, from 2010 to 2019. So the proportion increased from 24% of all candidates to about 31% or 1/3 of all candidates. In that sense, this is a change that is happening, that more women are also coming out to apply for these exams. And again, of course, there's one thing that one has to be cautious about, that is this change again, this rise in terms of willingness to join the bureaucracy, is this again concentrated or limited to certain social groups? Even there, what we find is that this increase is kind of happening across the board. There's an increase among SCs, there's an increase among STs, and there's a similar increase among OBCs. So in some senses, this is a phenomena that's taking place across the board. Now, why would this be happening? So I think why would something like this would be happening? And changes like these are not instantaneous. These are not changes that would happen within a couple of years. We have to think of these changes as kind of a culmination of developments taking place over decades. Now, two big changes we know that are happening. One, there's a general change or improvement in society, improvement in gender equality in terms of just social attitudes, and various surveys from the National Family Health Survey, Pew Survey, etc., confirm that there has been some attitudinal change that has taken place in India over the last few decades. Number one. So of course, so that's perhaps contributing to this change, wherein parents are now more willing to allow are more willing to allow or be part of their are more willing to allow their daughters to join these professions. There's a greater acceptance to that. Number two, what's happening, and that's the big change, is that all these exams of bureaucracy, when we talk about, requires higher, most of these positions require higher education as a minimum eligibility criteria. And one big change that we have seen in India over the past few decades is the substantial rise of girls entering higher education. So we'd already seen a rise in terms of girls completing class 12, but now over the last few decades, what we have seen is that there's a substantial rise in the proportion of women actually going on to pursue higher education. Now, just think about this in terms of one data point, in terms of gender parity in higher education. So now we've essentially reached a stage where, in terms of gender parity, we actually have the number of women enrolled in higher education is always nearly equal, and in some states actually higher than the number of men enrolled in higher education. Now, what that means is that automatically creates a pool of girls among whom there would be a segment which would then not only stop at completion of their degree, but would also want to pursue professional opportunities, and many of them would go on to appear for these exams and attempt to join civil services. So in that, and this change and improvement in higher education, again caused by various factors, government initiatives, larger attitudinal changes, is again a culmination of processes taking place over a few decades. And what we are seeing now is in some ways a culmination of these larger changes.
Yeah, I mean that's quite interesting, right? So now we have, in terms of at least higher education enrollment, there's almost parity, and as you said that now we've reached the stage of around 34%, and maybe in like a decade or so, it should increase further. But does this tell something about, like is this also accompanied by some social change? So for example, uh, is there any evidence, or is there kind of a concern that, okay, there is higher representation of women, and that's good, but still, the representation in powerful ministries, or at the higher levels of bureaucracy, and the kind of work that they're given, is there a parity, or is there more equality in that aspect, or is there still kind of social stereotypes that exist, that kind of make it essential that that gap needs to be bridged in the next few years as well?
So yes, so that is a very important point that you have raised. So we see all this rise in proportion happening. We see all this rise in terms of the recent batches and new joinees. We are seeing this change, but what there's also sort of areas of caution, and this would be one wherein what is the kind. So once women enter the bureaucracy, what are the kind of positions that they are able to get? And there, what one finds is that there are kind of gendered patterns, for the lack of better word, in terms of the distribution of positions and postings. So for instance, women would be more likely to be posted in ministries or departments related to culture, education, or welfare related positions, and of course women related positions and programs. So that's definitely there. So what we are seeing is that there is a rise in terms of proportion of women joining, but there's still a gendered pattern in terms of the kind of positions they get. Now, similarly, there's a whole thing about top positions. Now, what we must remember is that change in top positions is also going to be gradual and slow, because people are not. So, for example, positions of secretaries, etc. Individuals are not getting directly recruited to top positions. Essentially, it's you join, and then over your service, over 2 or 3 decades of service, you rise up the ladder. Now, which is why change at that level, change at the top level would also take time. So over time, when the proportion of joinees increases as it's been happening, similarly we will slowly see a change at we will see a change and improvement at various levels.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? So yeah, so I think if this proportion has been increasing kind of relatively recently, so it will also take some time, in like at least a decade or so, for this change to be reflected at the higher uh, bureaucracy. And is this kind of a trend visible in not just bureaucracy but other aspects of governance? So, like, is there any data or insight into is there a similar increase in women representation in judiciary, at least at the state levels? And then we'll come to politics as well.
Yes, absolutely. So what we find is that, or what we find is that even when it comes to kind of the lower judiciary, where recruitment is often through exams, so even there we find a substantial increase in terms of proportion of women getting recruited in the lower bureaucracy, and there again, I must say that the change is happening kind of across the board. It's happening in various states. So, for example, UP again, right? There's been an increase, like now nearly one third of subordinate judges in UP currently are women, and this is among all judges currently. So, which is why the proportion within recent batches might be even higher. So this is something, as I said, that's happening across not just within the administrative bureaucracy, but which is happening in various arms of the state as well,
Yeah, I mean that
wherein there is kind of wherein appointment is not elected but kind of meritocratic appointment or appointment based through exams.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
yeah. So I mean that's quite interesting, right? So now if we think about rise, I mean women representation in politics, for example, this is where there is not any test, any exam. It is not based on merit. It is more about like more if party gives you ticket or something like that. So if we see a greater representation, nearing 30, 40, or even 50% in some cases in judiciary and bureaucracy, at least at the starting level, this is not really reflected in politics, right? It's still like about, I think it is about 17%. So,
So
uh,
it's more than 10%. It's I think about 13 or 14% in the
oh,
current
okay.
Lok Sabha.
Yeah. And then, like, and I'm assuming that the trend would not be that different in state assemblies as well.
So it would be kind of similar, but of course, like in terms of representation in politics, especially in politics at the higher level, it's definitely much lower, and a lot more needs to be done. Which is why I think now with the which is why I think there was an across the board consensus on the idea or the need for the women's reservation bill, which should take care of this. Because even when you think of politics, remember it's a problem at the assembly election level, it's a problem at the national level, but it ceases to remain. But when it comes to local elections, local body, both urban local bodies and panchayats, because of reservation and most states having 50% reservation, there we see ample women reservation,
Yeah, but like,
and that has again been studied considerably, and we know about the positive impact that has had on local level development.
no, that does make sense. But what I'm kind of curious about is that if, I mean, Indians are okay educating their women, and then they rising up the ranks in bureaucracy and judiciary, why is that not the case, let's say, in politics, right? We do not have a woman reservation in bureaucracy or in judiciary, but this has happened organically and quite fast in some ways. So is like what kind of a socio-cultural uh, indication does this fact give that we are still looking towards women reservation for increasing representation in politics, this despite the fact that although there is women's reservation of almost 50% or more sometimes at the urban and rural local bodies, that is not translated to those leaders kind of rising up the ranks and going up to become uh, councillors or MLAs or MPs. So why this kind of a difference? Is there kind of any study, or what do you think? Is that, are we not socially ready as much as we are ready in terms of just our education?
So I think more than whether we are socially ready or not, that becomes a demand side concern. I think more than a demand side concern, I think we have to think about this from the supply side. And we have to just think about broadly in terms of the process that's taking place here. So when it comes to election to the parliament, election to legislative assemblies, the political process is far more subjective, it's far more discretionary, it's far more contingent on networks than appointment to bureaucracy. So appointment to bureaucracy is largely an objective process, right? You give an exam, your recruitment is based on scores, the exam is the same for everybody, and recruitment happens. So it's an objective process wherein there's very limited scope for any kind of discretion and networks to operate. But when we think about politics, politics is all about access to resources. Politics is a lot about networks. And politics is a lot about somebody making some kind of discretionary decisions. And when discretionary decisions are being made, that's where biases, that's where stereotypes, that's where access to resources, that's where networks come into play. And that's why it becomes harder for women aspiring to become politicians to even enter that space. And I think what happens is that, and there's kind of a feedback loop that operates in the sense that there are role model effects. So only when you so when you see women joining, so when young girls would see women joining certain spaces, they would feel more inspired, or they would feel that it's possible for them also to attain that, to do that. And I think in politics we have not been able to break that cycle because of all these blockages, and in bureaucracy, because through the natural process we have been able to break that. The feedback loop, and role model effects have started kicking in.
Yeah, that's so if I understand correctly, is that because politics is more subjective and not as objective as, let's say, as giving an exam, so women find it much harder. I mean, like they have to fight, like they have to fight harder for representation and for their own voice in, let's say, politics, as compared to bureaucracy and judiciary. On top of that, I think the stereotypes, because it is more subjective, and because it is something, like very you have to be in constant contact with the people. Women representation is much less in politics. But I'm curious about the supply demand kind of a difference. Is that okay? So now we say that because there is a significant rise in educational attainment and and school enrollment in women, for women, and that leads to more educated women, which leads to them applying for more jobs via exams and things like that. So that is one way which we understand. But now it's also been almost 3 decades that we have had women reservation in urban and rural local bodies, panchayats and all. So that should give a steady supply of women leaders, right? Because if so, why has that not translated? Like, is it mainly the stereotype, and that is something that now needs to be kind of addressed? And is there a way that we can address, or reservation is kind of the only way? Because if reservation was not needed, even though it was I mean, I understand that it was objective in bureaucracy and judiciary, why is there a need for reservation? Like, I'm just trying to understand that And this representation has not really changed also in like last 2 3 Lok Sabhas. Like the woman representation has not really changed dramatically. So why this kind of difference?
So I think so also when we think about supply and supply side dimensions when it comes to politics, we have to think about it's a two-step process, right? It's not just about getting elected, it's also about getting a chance to get elected, right? Getting a party ticket. Now, if I want to become a bureaucrat, then it's my decision. I will consult my family and etc. And I will apply for the exam, and I have a shot at it, right? When it comes to politics, even if I aspire to, say, contest an election at a higher level, it's not necessarily just my individual decision, right? Just to be able, like, to be able to contest an election is itself a contest in some ways in which I'm engaged with various leaders and individuals in my constituency. So, yes, reservation at the lower levels may have created a pool of women who are aspiring to sort of rise up the ranks in politics, rise up in politics and get elected at higher levels. But that's not enough, right? Because for them to actually be able to do that, they still have to get party tickets. And what we find is that this gender disparity is not only a gender disparity in terms of the proportion of women getting elected, but there's also a disparity when it comes to the proportion of women that parties are nominating. So, which is why one feels that there's a lot of the various factors such as stereotypes, networks, etc., operate and become kind of hindrances and blockages in terms and roadblocks for women in politics, and that's why having something like the Women's Reservation Act the overcomes those roadblocks.
Yeah, I mean that's quite interesting, right? That even if you want to become a politician, right, but the fight for tickets, the stereotypes, networks, all of those kind of play a role in kind of constraining the avenues that, let's say, female aspiring politicians have in our system. So I am curious, Pranav, is that now if you see a higher representation of women in bureaucracy and in judiciary, does that have an implication on how administration is done, or like kind of what kind of like like will there be kind of a change in terms of role models that people see, especially young women, or we see or will there be more problems, oh, I am a male politician, I am not going to listen to this female BDO or DM. Like what kind of implications is this change having and is expected to have?
So I think sort of that's a very important question, like because that kind of underlies that is it just a trend in terms of greater participation that we should celebrate, or does it really have, or does it have far-reaching implications? And I think it does. So we don't have solid evidence right now because it's an emerging trend. But from what we know from very representation, rising representation or increase in representation in other domains, if we kind of just extrapolate from that and we kind of apply our learnings from that, I think we should see some really positive far-reaching implications in two broad ways. One is just as you said, kind of symbolic representation or role model effects kicking in. So just think about a young girl walking into a government office, which say a decade or so back was almost 90%, 95% men. And now if she just finds many more women in that office, just the idea of what a government office looks like or what a bureaucrat looks like, a typical image of a bureaucrat in the mind of a young girl changes, or these positions, these opportunities become achievable in their mind. So that automatically kicks in role model effects. And we've seen things like this happening in case of rising women representation in terms of local bodies. Now, two is substantive representation. Or what is the idea of substantive representation? The idea of substantive representation is that does increasing representation in terms of having more individuals from a particular group in any position, does that also have substantive effect, or does that also lead to changes in real world outcomes for that particular group? Are there policy implications that one could see? Now, that again is likely to happen in multiple ways. Number one, it's likely that women bureaucrats at across various levels are more likely to kind of engage in policy making or governance that brings focus to women issues, or be more kind of understanding when it comes to dealing with women centric issues. So that's number one in terms of focus on kind of issues, or just in terms of their ability to deal with certain issues. Two is that we know that there's a whole problem of gendered nature of citizen state interaction, or even interaction from between lower level politicians and bureaucrats. So, for example, research by Bhumi Purohit, who's professor at Georgetown University, shows that gender bias when it comes to the way BDOs interact with block development officers interact with sarpanches. Now, there again, think of a substantial change happening. So now the proportion of women BDOs is very low, but if that kind of increases substantially over the or continues to rise, then we may see end of those gendered nature of interaction between sarpanches and politicians. Similarly, just in terms of responsiveness of a local bureaucrat to citizens. Now, there again, we know gender disparities, gender based differences operate, and those interactions may improve. And that in itself could have far reaching implications in terms of real world outcomes, in terms of provision of public service delivery at the local level.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think what it will also kind of do is that I think it it likely is also to bring kind of change in perception of politicians, right, in how they see women representation. So, like what we were talking about earlier, the problem is also women not getting tickets, right, to contest um, uh, for electoral representation. And obviously it is the kind of senior leaderships or local dynamics that also play a role in kind of deciding who gets ticket and who does not. But this increased interaction with female bureaucrats, female judges, and everything, I think, would kind of hopefully create a much more useful and positive kind of virtuous cycle, where it leads to politicians being more understanding of the fact that you need female representation, and then also then trying to actively make sure that they give more tickets to female candidates. Yeah, I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion, Pranav, and I am quite optimistic, to be honest. I mean, it's very heartening to see that in bureaucracy and judiciary, things are on the upswing. There is a significant improvement in representation, and I think hopefully this is going to kind of do have a positive spillover effects, to larger society. And hopefully this would also lead to greater participation of women in electoral politics. Do you have anything to add to that, Pranav?
Yes, I think I just wanted to add one small thing. I think your conclusion, I would have the same conclusion. I would be optimistic as well. Just that I would say that the optimism should be slightly cautious, and we should be willing to think that these changes or these developments may not be rapid. These could be slow and may take time. But even I would be as optimistic as you are.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, it is a long haul. I mean, even it took 30 years. To for it to go from 13 to 34, and it's still not there yet, and it's much more abysmal in politics. But yeah, it's a positive trajectory. But as we also discussed earlier, right, just women representation is not enough. It has to be substantive as well. So hopefully we go towards that direction. I think that with this increasing participation of women in women even as voters, right? And now we see even parties trying to see that women voter is a voter in her own right, and trying to address issues that are more close to them, trying to address them in their welfare schemes. All of this kind of would help in getting more substantive representation and much more resilient representation that does not change with one party in power or the other. It is a change which is secular and more sustained. So thanks a lot, Pranav. It has been an excellent discussion, and I look forward to talking to you again in some time when we have some other good news where like women in India have increased their representation and are making all of us proud.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.